Welcome to Layer the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. And on today's episode, I have a very special guest, as we are going to be discussing the new wave of British heavy metal from someone who was there. These are firsthand accounts of what really happened. Many of us my age and younger, we've read about it in the books, but here we're going to get somebody who was there on ground level to give us what it was like when all this was happening. And he's also going to be giving us some under the radar new wave of British heavy metal bands, cool bands that we should check out. So let me introduce my special guest. I have here with me today, author and journalist, John Tucker. John, thank you so much for joining me here at The Layer.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
John put out a book. When was your new wave of British heavy metal book put out, John?
That was my first book. That came out in 2006.
Okay, right. And it's just called The New Wave of British Heavy Metal, right? Unfortunately, it's out of print, but we were talking off camera here, and John was mentioning that, there's, I guess, maybe a possibility that it could come back in print at some point. It's back in your possession.
There is, yes. The book went out of print, which meant that the rights reverted to me, and now I need to do something with it. It's actually called Susie Smiled, The New Wave of British Heavy Metal.
Okay.
If that helps. But because I had a thing about the number of times the name Susie crops up there's Susie Hold On, there's Susie Smiled. Always called, virtually every female character is called Susie, and that kind of stuck in my head. But hopefully the theory is if I can find someone who'll take it on, we'll spruce it up, we'll bring it back up to date. A lot's happened on the genre since 2006. And we'll put it back out there.
Fantastic. That'll be awesome. When you do, please let us know so we can pass it on to the people here at The Layer. And also, I'll be leaving a link in the description down below for John's website, where you can get more information on John, what he's up to. He's also a journalist. He writes for magazines and stuff like that. So if you need more information on John, there'll be a link in the description down below. So John, I forgot to ask you, where are you joining us from? Where are you today?
I am in Torquay, in Devon, in the UK. So that's on the southwest coast.
Okay, fantastic.
Very pretty seaside town. Not a great place to grow up if you are into metal, but we did have a few bands in the end, so it was okay. Okay,
so that's where you grew up?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, bounced around the country and then ended up back here in 10 years ago or so. But yeah, back in my hometown.
Okay. All right. So take us back then. Let's go back. What was your first, I like to ask people this when they come on the channel. I say, who was the band? What was the song? What was the album that got you into music, or that got you into rock? Like, where was the seed planted for you?
Right. Long story, but I started off listening to the charts as most kiddies did back then. And actually I got hooked on Gary Glitter, which is back in the wrong horse, really. But I love the double drum sound, and I like the overall sound. So I'm listening to the charts. At the same time, there's things like Status Quo, Paper Plane, things like that, things that are a little bit different. The other thing is I got an older brother. He's not a great music fan, but he started bringing home Deep Purple albums from school in the little school collective. So I got into that. I got into Mott the Hoople, which took me to Bad Company. And then it was all downhill from there recently. It's just after that, it was school dinner money. No, that's not right. After that, it became trying to save up money to buy records. And then I saw Iron Maiden. And after that, every penny I got went into music. No more school dinners, no more nothing. Just everything went into music, and it's all Iron Maiden's fault.
Okay, well, this is all right. This is a good place to jump into the new wave of British heavy metal then. So you saw Iron Maiden. When did you see Iron Maiden?
That was December 10th, 1979. It's up there. December 10th, 79. At Exeter, it's about 20 miles up the road. It was, what we didn't know and what the band didn't know is it was one of those clubs that has like a kiddie disco. So the disco finished at 10, and then the actual band came on at 10:30. So there's like a half-hour changeover. So we're in the pub opposite, and the band came in. Didn't know the band, no idea who they were. They were very impressed that we'd come, 20, 25 miles. But none of us had the EP at this time. We'd all bought it on mail order, but none of us had the Soundhouse tapes. And that was it. That was, I'd seen 3 or 4 bands before that. But then Iron Maiden, yeah, very, very special indeed.
Okay, so Was this a small club that you saw them in?
Yeah, this was about, I don't know, 300, 400 tops, perhaps. It wasn't full. Of course, down here, down in the provinces, things still weren't really filtering through. Sounds had identified this new wave of British heavy metal thing in around May 1979. But I mean, to us, it was just names in the music papers, really. It was only at this sort of time that the band started to filter through and come down this way. So seeing a band like Iron Maiden in the flesh was a real big deal for a bunch of, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds.
Okay, so give me the layout here. Where was Iron Maiden from in relation to where you are now? So are you close to like Iron Maiden's hometown, like where Steve?
Nah, we're about 200 miles away. Maiden are London based. London's about 200 miles from here. You know, there's just quite a geographic, and I mean, in the UK, that's a long way. I know in the States, people will drive for days. In the UK, you know, we don't drive that far. So 200 miles is a very, very long way.
That's a long way here too, even for somebody to, but still. So, okay. So how did you hear about, you mentioned that before you saw them, you had already ordered the Soundhouse tapes. How did you hear about them? Did they didn't play them on the radio, right? So
it was purely by, at that time, it was purely by seeing what was happening in the Sounds newspaper. Okay. Maiden had got a few column inches. A friend had tipped me off, and it was like, you know, you might like this. And so, I mean, the single was £1.25 with postage, something ridiculous for something that you can now sell for what, £600 now. So I thought I'd take a punt. You know, I had the money, got a little postal order from the post office, and sent it off as you naively did as kids. But yes, it took a little while to come. I think there was a slight pressing problem, but it took a while for it to come. So yeah, the next thing you know, this band is trailered as being up the road. So let's go and give it a shot. I think 7 of us piled into a car. I know one was laid across the back, 4 in the back seat, one was laid across us.
God.
So yeah, not very safe, but it was a fabulous night. It was a really good gig.
Fantastic.
Obviously, it's a really good gig. It's Iron Maiden. It's bound to be a good gig, isn't it?
So do you still have that EP, that original EP?
Yes. Oh yes.
Nice.
That's here until I die. I mean, to be fair, I don't play it that much, but like a lot of people, I copied it to CD so I can maintain the vinyl, and I do play that quite a lot. But as a kid, when I first got it, obviously it got played to death.
Yeah,
so different. You know, got absolutely hammered. And that was the 4-piece. That was just after they'd got shot of Tony Parsons. So that was, you know, your Diano, Harris, Murray, and Doug Sampson lineup. So that was a bit special. At the time, it was just a band, but now to realise that was the short-lived, that lineup, you know?
Sure. So, okay, you get the Soundhouse EP there in the mail. When you first heard it, you had read about them in Sounds.
Yep.
Did you get the EP before you saw them live? No. Okay. So the first time you saw them live was the first time you heard them.
Yes.
Right? Okay. So what was your impression of them musically when you heard them? Was there any reference point? Did you go like, wow, these guys, I mean, in hindsight now, we can sit back and hear some of their influence and say, yeah, I can hear some UFO, you can hear some Thin Lizzy in their sound. But when you heard them, just what was your first impression of them?
It was amazing. It was I thought it was different because at the time, I didn't have that great a collection. I had a lot of Deep Purple, a lot of sort of the older names, bit of UFO, bit of Priest, but nothing radical. Well, Motorhead, I suppose, was lively and radical at the time, but nothing quite like what I heard, because yes, those influences are there, and they can be obvious now, but throwing all those things together as they did,
yeah,
and having stuff that was, you know, I mean, Iron Maiden itself, it's quite progressive. There's all these time changes and things, and you don't expect this, and nothing was straight and 4 minutes of a song that starts and finishes. The musicianship was amazing. Okay, maybe I was still a bit new. It's about 4th or 5th gig I'd seen, so it was, you know, it was a bit different in that respect. Everything was a bit different, but the energy levels, the excitement, meeting the band before they went on was obviously a bit of a buzz as well. But I had nothing to measure it by. This was just so different. This was completely unique as far as I was concerned as an 18-year-old at the time. Nothing to liken it to at all. So it just, it was a turning point. It's a definite turning point.
Wow. So you got to meet them there before they started playing, while they were setting up or something?
Well, just in the pub across the road. They couldn't get into the club either because it was a teenage disco. Yeah, so they all came in, including poor Diano in his pork pie mod hat. Which, wow, what the hell was that? But it was if you could bottle a gig and keep it forever, that would be the one.
Wow, what a great story. Okay, so where was Neil Kay and his sound house? Was that in London?
That's in London, yeah.
Okay.
A couple of years later, I went to university and I met a Londoner. I met a woman who was a big metal fan, and she was amazed because she lived just down the road from Neil Kay's Soundhouse Bandwagon place. And she was amazed that I'd heard of it. But of course, in Sounds, it got such publicity. Most metal fans who read Sounds would know exactly who Neil Kay was and exactly what he was doing.
Right. Did you ever go there when he was?
Regrettably, no. I didn't really go to London that much because it was a big trek.
Right. It was far.
Yeah, no. That and the Newcastle Mayfair are two places I really wish I'd been to and never did.
Okay. So, all right. So you're reading about the new wave. Were they calling it the new wave of British heavy metal by 90s? Yes. Okay. So you're reading about this in Sounds. You get to see Iron Maiden. Where does it go from there with you? What do you start seeing other bands? Or now where you live, do any bands come close to where you live, or did you have to drive far out of your area in order to get a gig?
Right, at that time, the floodgates opened, really, as Saxon said in Denim and Leather. All of a sudden, things happened. So, as I said, firstly, let's stop spending money on anything other than records. So you can walk to school, you can walk back from school, and you don't need dinners anymore. So that gave me a bit of a war chest. So Maiden was December. In February, the same club hosted Def Leppard and Witchfind. Great bill. March, we had Sledgehammer. Then in May came Girl. And then in June, during my exams, which is not great, but during my exams, Saxon and Tigers of Pantang and Budgie with Witchfind, Budgie with Vardis, both played my local town hall. Wow. So all of a sudden, this thing that had started kind of in London, although it was, there was a lot happening elsewhere in Newcastle and in the Midlands, it did start to spread. From the early parts of 1980, it really did hit all parts of the country. So yeah, at that time, when I had limited resources to travel, the bands were coming my way.
Okay. Was there like one club in your town that hosted all these bands, or were there a couple clubs? Or?
No, the Saxon gig and the Budgie gig with Vardis supporting both took place at the local town hall. There was no real clubs in Torquay. And then the others were the same club in Exeter. So we'd get, one of us could drive.
Right.
Or we'd get the train up and get a taxi back and split the cost between us. So needs must. But that's when the new wave of British heavy metal did start becoming really national. Bands were going everywhere. And and selling really well, doing good business. Yeah.
So as you're hearing these other bands, is Iron Maiden's, are they sort of the band which you're comparing all these other bands to? Because you heard them first.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. At the end, I suppose kind of your first love always hits the bass. And although I was a big Deep Purple fan, and the second gig I saw was Gillan, actually down in a club in Torquay, which then closed a while afterwards. Maiden, this was new, and I adopted this because it seemed like it was talking to me. I don't know if you know what I mean, but all of a sudden it seemed like this was for me and the likes of me. And Maiden became the benchmark.
Yeah, and you're at the perfect age. You said you were 17, 18 when you saw Maiden in 79. So did this feel like, even though you were a fan of Deep Purple and some of those bands, did this really feel like, here's the new guard, here's okay, this is what's happening now. Deep Purple's cool, Led Zeppelin's cool, that's cool, but you know, here's the new, this is for us, this is for our generation, you know. Definitely. Deep Purple was for your older brother and stuff like that.
Most definitely, because I mean, I remember once thinking, so what happens when the likes of Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin, who at the time were still going, and Black Sabbath, what happens when all these bands go? What's going to fill the void? And within months of mindlessly thinking that to myself, all of a sudden this whole new tranche of bands, with, to my mind, I have made at the forefront, come and fill the void. Yes, I think that was a definite new thing. And I was at the right age, as you said, at the right time to think, yeah, this is for me. As you said, I've never turned my back on the older bands. They're all good. Yeah. I still collect them to this day. But all of a sudden, this was something that I thought was what I wanted to listen to. Yeah, game changer, definite game changer.
That's amazing. How about Diamond Head? Did you ever see them during that?
Diamond Head, I first saw, moved to university. Now, I mean, I've gone from a very small town at the extremes of Devon. I'm now in South Wales. Again, not really on the gig circuit, but there was a really cool club in Meath called the Talk of the Abbey. Lots of bands played there. So saw Diamond Head in February of 1980 when they turned up at Meath. Again, it was brilliant. Small club. I mean, there was no stage. There was a sort of semicircle of monitors with one guy having a stereo ghetto blaster actually balanced on the monitor, taping the gig. And four of us went from Swansea. I took this young lady, Trudy, who was used to live near the bandwagon. She sat down at the front, cross-legged, and at one point when Sean Harris needed to move the mic stand, she had to move because she was kind of sat on one of the legs of the mic stand. So that's how small the club was. Diamond Head, brilliant. And I became good friends with Brian. Every so often I talked to Brian Tatler. I've done a few bits and bobs with him in the past. I ghosted or worked with him on his autobiography. So Diamond Head were a very influential band to a lot of people, and to my development, certainly. Love them, still do. Great band.
Wow. What about at Def Leppard when you saw them? Did they seem a little different than the other bands? Did you have any inclination that, you know, that they would go on to be the success that they would? When you were hearing all these bands, you know, was there any thought of like, wow, these guys are going to break big, or did it feel like it was going to be, this is our thing, it's just going to stay at this sort of pub level?
That's a really good question, because you and I probably both asked fans, you know, back in the day, do you think you'd be doing this 40 years later? And they all say, no, we didn't think it would last that long. I guess at the time, it was just being in the moment. I guess, you know, you didn't really think about what would happen next. Def Leppard, I thought, were an extremely good band. They were a lot of fun to see. As far as I were concerned, they were another heavy metal band. I know these days they feel that if they're put in with the new wave of British heavy metal, it limits them, it defines them in a way they don't want to be defined. But the band I saw was a young metal band, very much so. They played a cracking gig. And afterwards, we talked to Joe Elliott, got all their autographs. And he said that if we were to send our record sleeves up to him with return postage, they would all autograph them and send them back. And we did just that. We collect the sleeves up. We worked out the return postage, posted them up to him, and he sent them back.
Yeah, that's
just like that, you know.
Were you collecting? I know the new wave of British heavy metal is famous for releasing a lot of 7-inch singles. Were you collecting those at the time, or do you still have some? You know, I know that was a big thing of that scene where some of the smaller bands would just put out 7-inch singles and stuff like that. So were you collecting those, or?
Yes, yeah, afraid so. You know, complete full-on fanboy. I mean, there were. I mean, the problem was a lot of bands didn't really tour. They played gigs, but they didn't really tour. And some bands stayed within their localities, because it is a big deal to travel around the UK and know you're going to make enough money to go from Newcastle to South Wales. So I didn't get as many as I wanted to at the time, but then all of a sudden, the new wave of British heavy metal fell out of fashion, and you could pick up a lot of singles in the record shops quite cheaply. So I've got a fair collection. It's not the biggest. It doesn't list every record in the encyclopedia, but it's a fair collection. And besides, if you're going to go to a gig, isn't a record the perfect souvenir to bring home?
Yeah. Okay, so Iron Maiden gets signed in 1980. Mm-hmm. Saxon has already put out their first record. They're signed to somewhat, not a huge, you're saying that what was their label in 79? Carrie? I forget what the name was. Yeah.
Carrere, the French disco label.
Right. So the bands now are starting. Def Leppard, I forget when their first album comes out, 80, 81.
80, February.
All right, February of 80, Def Leppard comes out. So now you're starting to see these bands get signed. And now what are you thinking as these bands now are starting to move on to big labels and stuff like that? Does it seem like, okay, here it is now, it's going to explode for the world? Was that the feeling at the time?
Yes, I think once you start seeing these bands getting signed, and a lot of other bands, those early Neat bands all went to A&M Records. You're getting bands that are being picked up by major labels, and it does look like this is it now. This is going to be spread massively, exponentially. They're all going to be millionaires by Christmas, and there's no stopping it. It's a juggernaut now. But you don't really appreciate back then, certainly, how record labels work. They're not a charity. Yeah. Once you stop selling records, that's it. They'll drop you. So although it exploded big and it just looked, for that summer of 1980, there were compilation albums coming out 10 to the dozen. There were new releases. There were loads of singles. It really did seem like this was it. This was the world, today Luton, tomorrow the world sort of thing.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, things don't go that way.
Yeah, and it even seemed like, I always say this, that 1980, something happened in the collective consciousness of heavy metal. Even the old guards, like, Ozzy releases Blizzard of Oz, mm-hmm. Black Sabbath releases Heaven and Hell, Motorhead releases Ace of Spades, Scorpions release, what did they release in 80? Was it Love Drive or Animal Magnetism, right? So there are a few bands that foreshadow this, like the Scorpions, for instance, in 79 with Love Drive, where they're sort of leaving behind the 70s and that jammy, we talked about Deep Purple, like that sort of jammy, looser, more experimental nature. Think of, bands back then, they experimented a lot more with their albums and stuff. Think of Black Sabbath with Never Say Die, and you can say some of these things are failures. But in 1980, everybody kind of streamlined. Maybe it's the new influence of this new wave of British heavy metal, but even some of these old guard bands, they streamline their sound. The production gets tighter. The songs get a little more focused. They trim out the jammy late 60s, 70s nature of some of the things that they're doing. So I find it so fascinating how in 1980, if you just go down the list of the hard rock and metal albums that were released in 80, it's mind-blowing. And even like I said, the old guard bands, I guess they just felt it in the air. Dio comes into Black Sabbath, they release Heaven and Hell, Ozzy's Blizzard of Oz. They're just all these albums, they get a little more focused. And it's just as clear for me, kind of like, we're leaving the 70s, we're exiting the 70s, and some bands got there a little sooner, like Saxon's first album, although it's, they still haven't quite found their sound on that first record. But, we mentioned the Scorpions, Love Drive, it sort of has that more focused sound, leaving behind the sort of more jammy, Uli Roth, nature of the band. So I always just find it fascinating how, 1980 is such a pivotal, important, Judas Priest releases British Steel, you know what I mean? It's just like all these bands, they just sort of tighten up their sound. The production gets a little bit better. The songcraft gets a little more focused. So I just find 1980 to be a fascinating year.
Oh, indeed. Judas Priest are not a new wave of heavy British heavy metal band. And although some people love them in that category, they're not. But to take your point, of course, with Killing Machine, all the frills had gone out, and now you got 10 tracks, I don't think anything's more than about 4.5 minutes long. Bang, 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 bang. And there's your template. You know, most of these bands that you talk about are releasing singles, so they're relatively short and to the point. And then come 1980, and again, I can only see this from a British point of view. You know, we've got the new wave of British heavy metal. We've got loads of column inches devoted to pushing metal. There's the Friday Rock Show's pushing metal. And it did seem like a load of these bands, like the re-energized Black Sabbath, are getting somewhere. They're now getting almost like free publicity on the background of the new wave of British heavy metal bands. So it's certainly their game change. And as you said, there's a wealth of difference between Heaven and Hell and Never Say Die. Love them both, but they're very different records. Ozzy Osbourne's album, again, very, very focused. There was some great stuff released that year. And you know, the way we saw it at the time was this was directly because of the new wave of British heavy metal.
Yeah.
Lots of old bands were getting reboots. Magnum, I mean, you know, most of their stuff was, the early stuff indeed was very, very progressive.
Yeah.
Very proggy. But all of a sudden they release a 4-track live EP that's really punch in the face stuff.
Yeah.
We could only ever justify it in terms of what was happening to the music we were listening to. But yeah, it did seem like these bands were getting re-energized by the new UK scene.
What's your opinion on Motorhead? Do you consider them a new wave of British heavy metal band? Or
no, they predate it. They're far too early for that. I mean, love them, great. Overkill was one of those game-changing records when I took that home and thought, wow, this is different. Yeah. But no, you couldn't really put them in that category. There's loads of bands that get lumped in that really, they're already signed to a label and banging out several well-regarded albums. So no, I don't put them or Priest in that category at all. But they're very important for what happened next. Yeah,
they're very right. They're sort of, if you're making a timeline of one thing leads to another, you know, yeah, you would say like Judas Priest, Motorhead, and it's now, all right, as much as Steve Harris would rally against this, that punk had anything
I knew it was
British heavy metal, right? What do you feel was, you know, was there an influence there? You know, how does punk play into this, especially over, I mean, punk made such an impact over in, you know, where you were in Britain and everything. So it must have had some, even if it was just, you know, I always say this, even, of course, it's hard to sonically hear any connection between punk and early Iron Maiden, except for the fact that it's fast, it's sort of aggressive. Paul Di'Anno, his look, I guess, is a little, you know, punk. But for me, it was maybe sort of the DIY, do it yourself, you know, nature of punk, that maybe that influenced them. So what's your opinion here? How does punk tie into the new wave of British heavy metal, if at all?
Exactly as you said that. I don't think, I mean, I've seen some of Steve Harris's interviews and I know where he's coming from. I didn't get punk at all. So I'm quite happily avoiding punk and just carrying on listening to my Deep Purple and the old Judas Priest album. And I've said this in one of my books before, but I was 16 years old, I think. And a kid at school came up to me and said, you know what, Tucker, you're an effing dinosaur. I'm like 16 years old, but I bypassed punk. I didn't understand. Looking back now, you can understand the energy and the with sprawling unemployment. You can see the anger involved, but most of them played really badly, and that wasn't really what I was interested in. But the fact that they realised that they could sit at home forever and wait for the phone to ring, or they could get, I don't know, £100 together and press a record themselves. And there was a bunch at school who did just that. There was a bunch of older kids who formed a band and pressed their own record. Das Schnitz is the band. They're okay if you like punk. But you cannot deny that metal bands took that template and thought, okay, anyone can make a record. If you can get the money together and you've got the confidence to do it, and that's what punk did have, was the confidence to do it, make a record. And a record will do more for you than a demo tape ever will. So I think, and to be fair, Steve Harris's band made an independent record and sold it. And when the record company said, can we, we'd like to repress it, they said no. it did its job and it was done. So yeah, I think Steve would have to admit, anyone would have to admit that DIY ethos was new. There's not that many self-pressed singles before punk comes along. There are some, certainly, but it wasn't the done thing, and it wasn't what you did at the time.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was definitely a mainstay of punk, and that was definitely something that we borrowed.
Yeah. All right. So when does Castle Donington and Monsters of Rock? When does the big, that was the big festival back then, right? Was that the only one like that? A big festival that had heavy metal?
No, at the time there was the Reading Festival, which is now very different. Okay. But Reading tended to follow trends. So there was one, the 77 Festival was very punk. 78, sorry, was very punk. But its default was always rock. And 1980 and 1982 were really big on the metal side of things, rock metal side of things. Donington comes around in 1980. As you know, it was really just the way of Rainbow ending their Down to Earth tour. It was a one-off special gig. And to be fair, they didn't really have that many new wave of British heavy metal bands on the bill. Saxon the first year, Moore the second year, Diamond Head came in. They didn't really play that much to that sort of scene, because I suppose you could see those bands most of the time. What they did was bring across bands that you didn't really know of, like Riot, like Touch. Scorpions hadn't played that much in the UK at that time, not to a known audience. They'd done the clubs. So it wasn't that particularly NWOBHM friendly, but at the same time, we're now getting a bit of almost like a club or a family. It sounds a bit trite, but you know, people are clubbing together. People are staying together. People are seeing gigs together. So Donington was, that was a big deal. It was a good show, and it was a big deal.
Did you go to any of those shows?
I didn't get to Donington because of my own purposes till '84, but loved it. It was such a lot of fun. The trouble with the British weather is it tends to rain a lot. So there are a number of times I've got terribly, terribly wet at British festivals. But it was a good vibe. It was a very, very good vibe. But by '84, of course, the new wave of British metal was pretty much dead.
All right, well, that was going to be my next question. So 80, we're starting to see these bands get signed to bigger labels. You're starting to see them tour outside of Britain, UK. What for you, when did you feel like the new wave of British heavy metal peaked? You know, when did it start coming down? When do you sort of put it the end, if you will?
In my mind, 80, say early mid to 81 that was when you're going up. And after that, I think things start to slowly fade away. But to my mind, 1984 was the end, because from our point of view, in 1984, the music papers were starting to talk about, or starting to reinforce a lot of the American bands. This, you know, Metallica, Manowar, Motley Crue, etc., Rat, Steeler. And some of these bands started to come through. And by the end of '84, most of the big names had toured here. And I got the feeling that people no longer were that interested in the UK bands. They'd seen them, they were very good, but now there's a whole new breed is coming in, second US invasion sort of thing. And I think that's when the domestic market started to tail off.
Yeah.
Through '84, some of the bands started to try and change their sound to compete with the sort of Bon Jovi-ish AOR sound. And, you know, people didn't want to see bands that sounded American. They wanted to see American bands.
Yeah.
And to my mind, that's when it all started to run to an end, because now there's a lot of other bands coming in, and no one really cared that much about the British market anymore. Let's go see Motley Crue. Let's go see Wasp. Let's go see Manowar.
Yeah.
And I think the music papers did tend to, to push them more, because they're looking for something to sell their papers. And they can do an article on Witchfinder General, or they can write about Metallica. What's going to sell more papers, you know?
Right.
So to my mind, '84 was in mid-December 1984, Metallica headlined the Lyceum with Tank in support. Tank and Bernie Tormate supported actually, but Metallica headlined the Lyceum, and to my mind, that was the end, because that marked the beginning of a new wave, a new resurgence of different bands. And of course, now the sound is very different again. The kind of home produced 8 or 16 track recordings. And, you know, part of the beauty of the new wave of British heavy metal to me is that sound. You know, it's very unique. It's very, very different, but it's not great high fidelity.
Right.
Now you're coming in with these other bands who are coming in with a different sound. They're American, they're fun, they're brash, they play aggressively. Game over.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember too. I mean, I'm a little younger than you, but I started listening in 1980. You know, I was 10 years old in 1980. So I was listening to all that stuff. And I distinctly remember hearing Metallica for the first time. We have college radio stations over here that had metal shows, and you know, this is way before the internet, or I lived in a very remote place, so I didn't even have any access to any cool magazines. And I remember the radio DJ playing stuff from the first Metallica record, and this was so early on that the DJs at this station I listened to, they were mispronouncing the band's name. They were saying Metalicia. So I was walking around to friends at school going, "Got to check out this band called Metalicia." You know, so for the longest time, I thought they were, for like a good 2 years, I thought they were called Metalicia, until like somebody's older brother went, "It's not Metalicia, it's Metallica." You know, what's wrong with you? To this day, I still say that when I look at Metallica, I go, Metalicia. I still think that.
It's great. I mean, the first album, you know, but you can hear the first album is very NWOBHM influenced.
Oh yeah. Of course.
A friend who probably doesn't share particular obsession, you got to listen to this. And I knew of the band, and he bought it first. He puts it on. I'm thinking, well, there's a little bit of, that's quite Diamond Heady. That's a Diamond Head time change, yeah. That's a bit of definite Motorhead bit there, sort of thing. And I mean, if the internet had been around, the new wave of British heavy metal would be very, very different. Yeah. But you said there, you're living in isolation quite a lot. I mean, all these NWOBHM bands have got is coverage and sounds, and they do Kerrang and the radio. And if they can tour, but with no internet, people forget how difficult it was.
Yeah.
I mean, we were doing this over the phone on a transatlantic phone call that was both costing us an arm and a leg.
Yeah.
You know,
but in a lot of ways, it created, from what I gather from reading about the new wave of British heavy metal, that there was a sound for the new wave of British heavy metal, but you could dive in and break it down even further. You know, the guy's Saxon was from this area. Maiden was from this area, Budgie was from over here, Diamond Head was from over here. And inside all these places, these bands are real popular in their hometowns. And then there's little bands underneath them that, so that particular area kind of had its own vibe, its own take on the whole thing. So
very much so. I mean, you said about earlier, you mentioned that first Saxon album from '79. I had no idea it existed until Wheels of Steel came out, because it sold,
nothing.
I think Biff says in his book, sort of about 20,000 copies, but it was still quite local, probably to their local fan base, and without much press coverage, without being on the radio, just no one knows they exist. Then all of a sudden, Wheels of Steel comes out. They're getting national coverage. They're on top of the pops. God bless it. And you look back and find, blimey, there's another album. Didn't know that was there.
Yeah,
and it's very different. Like I said, they're still honing their sound. And Biff does moan about the backing vocals that John Verity sort of put on when they were in the studio. Yeah. Actually, I quite like that first Saxon album. It's very different, but it's quite charming.
Yeah, I like it too.
Saxon to be charming, that's the album to play.
Yeah, it's fascinating too. It's easy to forget how much music came out in a very short period of time. Bands back, you just mentioned Saxon, Wheels of Steel and Strong Arm of the Law both came out in the same year. I mean, like, bands were religiously putting out an album a year back then, and sometimes two, sometimes a studio album and a live album. And we've gotten so used to Iron Maiden, it takes them 5-6 years to put out an album. Same thing with Judas Priest. I mean, 5-6 years, that's like the whole career of the Beatles. You know, the Beatles
I like that. I'll use that one day. But I mean, it was madness to take Saxon off the road for Wheels of Steel to get him to write another album. But the fact is, you know, Strong Arm is a great album. They did 2 great albums in a year. I mean, the creativity involved is amazing. Like I said, these days, it's madness to put out 2 albums in a year. You're not going to sell.
Yeah.
So it's very, very different times. Great times, but very, very different times.
Yeah. Okay, so give us now, share with us some bands that you would recommend for people to check out. You know, whenever you say the new wave of British heavy metal, the first bands that come to everybody's mind are like Iron Maiden, Saxon, Def Leppard, you know, Diamond Head. But you were there. What are some bands that you think that don't get maybe the attention that they deserve, or you think people should check out if they want to dig a little deeper than just the usual suspects?
Okay, if you don't know, Holocaust from Edinburgh were a great band. Their first album was is one of my favorite albums of all time. Great sound. People probably know of them, but that first album is very, very good. And the live album they did afterwards, the Hot Curry and Wine, they are really, really good. I would definitely recommend people look into those. I'm never good with these things. How about a band from Portsmouth called Siege, who were female fronted? Single came out in '85, I think, Goddess of Fire. Only did the 1 single. So pretty hard to find. Oh, it's bound to be on YouTube. Everything's on YouTube. But that was really good. And I suppose there weren't that many bands with female singers or female bands in the new wave of British heavy metal. Timing was terrible. These days it would be so easy, but back then there weren't. Siege, Goddess of Fire, very good single. Again, probably people might know this, but after Satan did Caught in the Act, and then they became Blind Fury and did the Out of Control album. When they reformed in '86, and they did the Into the Fire EP, I believe it's called, 4-track EP. It's got a bit lost now because Satan don't really do that sort of thing. But that and the album Suspended Sentence. Suspended Sentence is very Metallica. It's bizarre that Metallica started off listening to the new wave of British heavy metal.
And so they started
listening to Metallica, exactly, it flips it. But that's a great album, and that tends to get a bit lost. Early Tokyo Blade stuff. They're a great band, Tokyo Blade. It's still going strong now, but in fact, their new album, or their latest album, which was last year, might have been early this year, excellent. But their first couple of albums, definitely worth listening to. And we could do this all night, but first Savage album, Loose and Lethal.
Oh, yeah.
On Ebony. So it's got that ebony sound, which people might or might not like. I love the guitar sound. I know they don't, but I do. Heard one of the songs off it on the Friday Rock Show. I thought, I've got to find this. Used to play it on the Friday night, and the Saturday morning would be like, record shop time, what are we going to buy? And that's a great album. There's not a duff track on that album. I think it's being reissued on the High Roller label in Europe at some stage this year. But fabulous, fabulous record by a really nice bunch of lads. So if they help, if not, email me and I'll give you a few more.
That's a great place to start. So, all right. Hey, this has been an absolutely fantastic discussion. I love this. This is so cool to hear somebody telling these stories, being there on, you read about these things so much, you read the stories about it, the history of the new wave of British heavy metal and everything, but to hear somebody who was there, when it was happening, it just gives you such a cool, unique perspective on the whole thing. So thank you so much for joining me here at the Lair, John. I really appreciate it. This was a great conversation. Hopefully we can have you back here at the Lair at some other point to talk some more, because I know we could go on and on this subject. I was just all ears on this one, smile on my face the whole time. I loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And yes, let's do it again sometime. Why not?
All right, we'll leave a link again to John's website in the description down below, so you can check that out and find out some of the things that he's up to. I'm also I wrote down here the bands that John recommended for us. I'll put them in the description too, so everybody can jump around on YouTube. Maybe even if I feel motivated, maybe I'll put a YouTube clip there of each one of these bands so people can check it out. So, all right, thanks again to John. Everybody out there, thanks, and until we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.
Thank you.